"I won't do it, Sarah." The words hung in the scorching desert air like a death sentence. She collapsed to her knees, her swollen belly pressing against the faded blue fabric of her dress. The merciless sun had baked the life from her lips, cracked them until they bled. Her husband's letter crumpled in her trembling hands, the letter that had promised her a new life in Colorado territory, the letter that had lied about everything. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. "Please," she whispered to the endless expanse of sand and sagebrush stretching before her. "Please, God, not like this." The baby kicked inside her, a desperate flutter against her ribs, as if sensing the danger they were both in. 3 days without water. 2 days since the stagecoach had broken down and the driver had taken the only horse, promising to send help that never came. The other passengers had walked toward what they hoped was civilization, but Sarah couldn't keep up, not in her condition. Her vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges like vultures circling overhead. The desert floor rushed up to meet her as consciousness slipped away, her last thought a prayer for the child she carried. The child who would never know its father's betrayal, never know that the marriage certificate in her pocket was as worthless as fool's gold. Somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats thundered across the hardpan earth. But Sarah MacBride could no longer hear them. The sound of approaching hooves should have been Sarah's salvation, but she was beyond hearing anything except the roar of blood in her ears. Jake Morrison had been tracking the broken-down stagecoach for 2 days, following the wheel ruts and scattered belongings that told the story of desperation. He'd found the coach first, stripped bare, one wheel cracked beyond repair, the horses long gone. Then he'd followed the footprints of the passengers who'd struck out on foot, their path weaving drunkenly across the desert floor. He hadn't expected to find anyone alive. The woman lay crumpled beside a scraggly mesquite bush, her dark hair fanned across the red dirt like spilled ink. Even unconscious, one hand protectively cradled her rounded belly. Jake's weathered face tightened as he dismounted, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. "Ma'am?" He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her throat. Her pulse fluttered weak as a dying bird. Her lips were white with dehydration, her skin burning with fever. Jake had seen enough death in his 34 years, from the battlefields of Gettysburg to the Indian raids that had claimed his own family. He recognized it hovering over this woman like a shadow, but something in her face, even slack with unconsciousness, reminded him of his sister Mary, the same stubborn tilt to her chin, the same determined set to her jaw even in defeat. He couldn't leave her to die. Working quickly, Jake lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her condition. She stirred slightly as he settled her across his saddle, murmuring something about letters and lies. Her hand clutched a crumpled piece of paper that fluttered to the ground. Jake retrieved it, his jaw tightening as he read the contents. Another mail-order bride scheme, another woman lured west with promises of love and security that were nothing but smoke and mirrors. The return address read, William MacBride, Copper Creek, Colorado Territory. But Jake knew Copper Creek. There was no William MacBride there, just a mining camp full of desperate men and broken dreams. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, then spurred his horse toward his ranch. The woman, Sarah, according to the letter, might survive if he could get water into her soon enough. The baby she carried was another question entirely, but Jake Morrison had learned long ago that some battles were worth fighting, even when the odds were stacked against you. The fever dreams came in waves, carrying Sarah between memories of her father's library in Boston and the harsh reality of sun-bleached bones scattered across endless desert. She felt coolness on her forehead, blessed, wonderful coolness, and forced her eyes open. A rough-hewn ceiling stared back at her, crossed with thick wooden beams that spoke of skilled hands and patient work. This wasn't the cramped stagecoach or the merciless open sky. This was shelter. Easy now. The voice was deep, gravelly, with the careful tone men used around spooked horses. You're safe. Sarah turned her head, wincing at the stiff ache in her neck. A man sat beside her bed. Not a bed, she realized, but a narrow cot covered with clean blankets. He was big, built like the longshoreman who worked the Boston docks, with shoulders that strained against his faded blue shirt. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent years squinting into the sun. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a whisper, her throat raw as sandpaper. "My ranch, about 20 miles east of Copper Creek." He lifted a tin cup to her lips. Small sips. The water was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down, to let it wash away the memory of sand and desperation, but he pulled the cup away after a few swallows. "Too much too fast will make you sick," he said. "You've been without water for too long." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, panic flaring in her chest. The baby? Still there, still moving. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, softened slightly. "But you came mighty close to losing both your lives." She closed her eyes, remembering the letter, the broken promises, the horrible realization that she'd been deceived. When she opened them again, the man was studying her with an expression she couldn't read. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said. "Found you collapsed out by Willow Springs yesterday." Sarah MacBride. The name felt foreign on her tongue now, tainted by lies. "At least, I thought I was." Something flickered across his features. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a familiar piece of paper. Her letter, the one that had promised her a husband, a home, a future that didn't exist. "There's no William MacBride in Copper Creek," Jake said quietly. "Never has been." The words hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd already suspected the truth. She'd spent her last dollar on the stagecoach fare west, had sold her mother's pearl necklace to buy the wedding dress that was probably scattered across the desert by now. She had nothing left. No money, no family, no place to go. "I see." She kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Then I suppose I'll be moving on as soon as I'm able." Moving on where? Jake's question was blunt, but not unkind. "You're 6 months along, near as I can tell, with no money and no one to vouch for you. The nearest town is Copper Creek, and it's a mining camp full of men who haven't seen a decent woman in months." Sarah lifted her chin, calling on the stubborn pride that had carried her through her father's death and her stepfather's cruelty. "I'll find work. I'm educated. I can teach or keep books or—" "Ma'am." Jake's voice cut through her desperate planning. "You nearly died of thirst yesterday. You and your baby both." The simple statement hung between them like a challenge, and Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, not quite breaking, but bending under the weight of impossible circumstances. 3 days of careful recovery had taught Sarah 2 things about Jake Morrison. He was a man of few words and even fewer smiles. But his hands were gentle as a priest's when he checked her fever. She sat at his rough-hewn kitchen table, watching him tend to a pot of stew that smelled like heaven after days of near starvation. The cabin was small but well-built, with shelves lined with books that surprised her. Dickens and Shakespeare sitting beside practical volumes on cattle ranching and crop rotation. "You read," she said, running her finger along the spine of a worn copy of David Copperfield. Some. Jake didn't look up from the stew. Long winters get lonely. The simple admission revealed more than he probably intended. Sarah studied his profile as he worked. The sharp line of his jaw, the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight. She'd learned to read men's silences during her years caring for her ailing father. This man carried grief the way some men carried scars. "Where is everyone?" she asked. "Your family, I mean." His stirring stopped for just a moment, so briefly she might have imagined it. "Dead." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of understanding. Sarah had heard that tone before, in her own voice when people asked about her parents, when they pressed for details about pain too deep to examine. "I'm sorry," she said simply. He nodded once, accepting her condolence without elaboration, and ladled stew into 2 bowls. The meat was tender, the vegetables perfectly seasoned. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite while watching Jake push food around his bowl without really eating. "This is delicious," she said. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My wife." The words came out reluctant, dragged from some locked place inside him. "She taught me before she died." Sarah heard the unfinished sentence as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. Another piece of Jake Morrison's puzzle fell into place. The careful way he avoided looking at her belly, the extra gentleness in his touch when he helped her to the chair, the haunted look that crossed his face sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. "How long have you been alone?" she asked softly. 3 years. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "Apache raid. They killed my wife and daughter." Sarah's breath caught. She'd heard stories of the raids, of course. Everyone back east had. But sitting here in this quiet cabin, looking at the empty spaces where a family used to be, made it real in a way that newspaper accounts never could. "What was her name?" "Your wife?" "Elizabeth." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Our daughter was Mary. She was 4. Sarah reached across the table without thinking, covering his calloused hand with her smaller one. He didn't pull away, but she felt the tension in his muscles, the careful control he exercised over every emotion. "They would have liked you," he said suddenly, surprising them both. "Beth always said this place needed a woman's touch." The observation hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither was ready to examine. Sarah withdrew her hand, acutely aware of her swollen belly, of the child moving restlessly inside her, of the impossible situation that had brought her to this moment. "Mr. Morrison," she began carefully, "I appreciate everything you've done for me, more than I can say. But I can't stay here indefinitely. It wouldn't be proper, and you deserve better than having a stranger's problems dumped on your doorstep." Jake studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. What if it wasn't just charity? "I don't understand." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over endless rangeland dotted with cattle. "This place needs work, more than one man can handle. The cooking, the cleaning, the garden that Beth used to tend. It's all gone to hell since—" He stopped, clearing his throat. "What I'm saying is, maybe we could help each other." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Marriage." The word came out flat, practical, stripped of any romance or sentiment. "On paper only. You'd have a name for the baby, a roof over your head, protection. I'd have help with the ranch, someone to cook and keep house." He turned back to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "It wouldn't be... that is, you'd have your own room, your privacy. I wouldn't expect anything beyond what we agreed to." The offer was reasonable, logical, and completely terrifying. Sarah stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what he was suggesting. A marriage of convenience to a man she'd known for 3 days, in a place that was still more wilderness than civilization. But what was the alternative? Return to Boston with a bastard child and no money? Try to make her way alone in a mining camp full of desperate men? Die in the desert with her baby, like she almost had already? Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do this for a stranger? Jake was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with some emotion she couldn't name. Because I know what it's like to be alone. The wedding took place 4 days later in the dusty front room of Copper Creek's only church, with Reverend Samuel Williams presiding and 2 minors serving as witnesses. Sarah wore her only clean dress, a simple brown cotton that barely stretched over her expanding belly, while Jake stood stiff as a fence post in his Sunday shirt and string tie. The ceremony lasted exactly 6 minutes, and the Reverend's raised eyebrows made it clear he had opinions about the hasty arrangement that he kept carefully to himself. Do you, Jacob Morrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? I do. Jake's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if he were agreeing to buy cattle or repair a fence. And do you, Sarah MacBride, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? Sarah's throat felt dry as the desert they'd rescued her from. I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride. An awkward silence stretched between them. Jake cleared his throat and leaned forward, pressing his lips briefly to Sarah's cheek in a gesture so chaste it might have been bestowed by a brother. The miners shuffled their feet and grinned, clearly expecting something more entertaining, but Jake was already turning away to shake the Reverend's hand. Much obliged, Reverend Williams. The fee we discussed? $5 will be fine. The Reverend accepted the money with another meaningful look. I'll be sure to register the marriage with the territorial government. And Mrs. Morrison, he added, addressing Sarah directly, you'll be welcome at our Sunday services. We have a small but faithful congregation. Mrs. Morrison. The name felt strange and foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. Sarah nodded politely and followed Jake out into the harsh afternoon sun, where their wagon waited beside the church's hitching post. The ride back to the ranch passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant lowing of cattle. Sarah kept her hands folded in her lap, hyper-aware of the man beside her, her husband now, though the word seemed to apply to someone else entirely. There's something we need to discuss, Jake said as they turned up the dirt track that led to his property. About the arrangements. Sarah's stomach tightened. What arrangements? The sleeping arrangements. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I meant what I said about your privacy. There's a small room off the kitchen that Beth used for sewing. I can move a bed in there for you. Relief flooded through her so suddenly it left her lightheaded. She'd been worrying about this moment since accepting his proposal, unsure what he might expect despite his promises. The child kicked inside her as if sensing her relief, a flutter of movement that made her smile despite everything. That would be perfect. Thank you. Jake nodded curtly. We'll need to set some ground rules about how this works. Of course. I'll provide for you and the baby. Food, shelter, protection. Doctor's visits when the time comes. In return, you'll handle the cooking, cleaning, mending. Maybe help with the garden if you're able. That seems fair. And Sarah? He glanced at her briefly, his gray eyes serious. "What happened to you before? The man who lied to you, brought you out here under false pretenses. That's in the past now. You're under my protection. Anyone who wants to hurt you or the baby will have to go through me first." The quiet intensity in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. This was a man who meant what he said, who would stand between her and danger without hesitation. After months of uncertainty and fear, the promise of protection felt like the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. "I understand," she said softly. "And Jake, thank you for everything." He nodded once, then pulled the wagon up in front of the cabin that was now her home. As he helped her down from the high seat, his hands strong and steady on her waist, Sarah felt the baby move again, a firm kick that made her gasp. Jake's hands stilled on her waist, his eyes widening. "Was that the baby?" she confirmed, laughing at his startled expression. "He's letting us know he approves of the arrangements." "He?" "Just a feeling I have." Sarah placed her hands over her belly, feeling another flutter of movement. "Though it could just as easily be a girl." For a moment, something unguarded flickered across Jake's features. Wonder, maybe, or longing. Then the careful mask slipped back into place and he stepped back, putting distance between them. "We should get you settled," he said gruffly. "You've had a long day." As Sarah followed him into the cabin, she wondered what it would take to see that unguarded expression again. 2 weeks of married life had settled into a routine as predictable as sunrise. Jake would rise before dawn to tend the cattle. Sarah would have breakfast waiting when he returned, and they would carefully navigate around each other like polite strangers sharing a boarding house. Sarah had transformed the sewing room into a cozy bedroom, hanging curtains she'd sewn from spare fabric, and arranging her few possessions on the small dresser Jake had built for her. The baby seemed to approve of the arrangement, growing more active each day, pressing against her ribs during the morning hours when she kneaded bread and kicked enthusiastically whenever she sat down to read. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she first spotted the riders approaching from the east. 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful gait of people who knew exactly where they were going. Something about their approach made her stomach clench with unease. "Jake," she called toward the barn where he was repairing a broken bridle. "Company coming?" He emerged immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the gun belt around his waist. Sarah had learned that Jake Morrison was a man who trusted his instincts, and right now, those instincts were clearly telling him to be cautious. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Stay away from the windows." "Who are they?" "Trouble, most likely." His jaw was set in the hard line she'd come to recognize as his fighting face. "Go on now." Sarah hurried into the cabin, but she couldn't resist peering through the gap in the curtains as the riders drew closer. The man in the center was well-dressed by frontier standards, wearing a black suit and riding a horse that probably cost more than most people made in a year. His companions were rougher-looking, with the kind of hard faces that spoke of violence as a profession rather than a last resort. They reined up in front of the cabin, and the well-dressed man dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his presence command attention. "Morrison," he called out. "We need to talk." Jake stepped out of the barn, his stance casual but ready. Sarah noticed he kept his right hand free, hovering near his gun. "Fletcher, what brings you to my land?" So this was Thomas Fletcher. Sarah had heard Jake mention the name with distaste. Fletcher owned the largest ranch in the territory and had a reputation for acquiring his neighbor's property through methods that weren't always strictly legal. "Business proposition," Fletcher said, his voice carrying the easy charm of a snake oil salesman. "That offer I made you last month? I'm prepared to be even more generous. And I'm prepared to give you the same answer I gave you then. My land's not for sale." Fletcher's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Things have changed since then, haven't they? Word is you've taken a wife, a pregnant wife." His gaze shifted to the cabin, and Sarah shrank back from the window. That changes a man's perspective on what's important. "My perspective hasn't changed," Jake said flatly. "You're still not welcome here." "Now that's where you're wrong." Fletcher remounted his horse, his companions flanking him like wolves. "See, I've been doing some investigating about your new bride. Interesting story, that. Mail-order bride arrangement that went wrong. Woman shows up in the desert. No family, no money, no past anyone can verify." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Fletcher knew about her deception, about the false marriage that had brought her west. But how could he know? And more importantly, what did he plan to do with that information? "Makes a man wonder," Fletcher continued, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "what other secrets she might be hiding. Makes him wonder if such a woman is really the marrying kind, or if maybe she's the kind who moves from town to town, leaving trouble in her wake." Jake's hand dropped to his gun. "That's enough." "Is it?" Fletcher's smile turned predatory. "Because the way I hear it, your marriage might not be as legal as you think. And if that's the case, well, the territorial marshal might be very interested to hear about a certain woman traveling under false pretenses, possibly fleeing from some crime back east." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting down panic. Fletcher couldn't know about her past. There was nothing criminal to know. But he was skilled at making innocent circumstances sound sinister. In a territory where law enforcement was scarce and a man's reputation was everything, even unfounded accusations could destroy lives. "What do you want, Fletcher?" Jake's voice was deadly quiet. "Same thing I've always wanted. Your land, your cattle, and now, your cooperation in convincing your neighbors that selling to me is in their best interests." Fletcher leaned forward in his saddle. "You've got 48 hours to think it over, Morrison. After that, I might have to take my concerns about your wife to the proper authorities." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following like dutiful shadows. Sarah waited until they were completely out of sight before rushing outside to where Jake stood motionless in the yard. "Jake, I need you to know, whatever he's implying about my past, it's not true. I never committed any crimes, never ran from anything except poverty and a stepfather who—" She stopped, realizing she was babbling. "The point is, I have nothing to hide." Jake turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "I know." "You know?" "I know you're not a criminal, Sarah. I can read people well enough to tell the difference between someone running from the law and someone running from bad circumstances." He paused. "But Fletcher doesn't need the truth to cause trouble. He just needs doubt." The simple statement crystallized her fears into cold reality. In a place where a woman's reputation was everything, even false accusations could destroy her chance at a decent life. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Jake's hand moved to rest on the butt of his gun, and his smile was sharp as broken glass. "We're going to fight." That evening, Jake rode out to visit his nearest neighbors, ranchers who'd received similar offers from Fletcher over the past year. Sarah spent the time cleaning rifles that didn't need cleaning and jumping at every sound from outside. The baby seemed to sense her agitation, turning restlessly inside her until she finally gave up on productive activity and settled into Jake's chair by the fireplace with a cup of chamomile tea. She was dozing when Jake returned, his boots loud on the porch boards. He came inside looking grim, hanging his hat on the peg by the door with more force than necessary. "What did they say?" Sarah asked. though his expression already told her most of what she needed to know. The Hendersons sold out last week. Fletcher made them an offer they couldn't refuse, especially after their barn mysteriously caught fire and their prize bull turned up dead. Jake slumped into the chair across from her. Tom Bradley's thinking about selling too. His wife's scared after what happened to the Hendersons. And the others? Standing firm for now. But Fletcher's been busy. He's bought up most of the smaller spreads over the past year, one way or another. Jake rubbed his forehead tiredly. He controls the water rights to Silver Creek now, which means he can squeeze out anyone who depends on that water source. Sarah felt the baby kick, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her wince. What does he really want? It can't just be about land. Railroads coming through next year. Companies looking for a route to the mining camps up north, and they'll pay handsomely for right-of-way access. Fletcher wants to control enough territory to force them to deal exclusively with him. And our land is in the way. Our land sits right where they'll want to build their depot. Fletcher gets that, he gets rich. We keep it, he has to find another route. Jake's smile was grim. He's not the kind of man who accepts obstacles. Sarah set down her teacup, her mind racing. What if we went to the territorial marshal? Told them about Fletcher's threats? With what proof? Fletcher's too smart to threaten anyone directly, and the marshal's office is 3 days' ride from here. By the time they could investigate, Fletcher would have all his stories straight and witnesses to back him up. The hopelessness in his voice made something fierce stir in Sarah's chest. She'd spent too many years watching her stepfather bully and manipulate, seeing him use his position and connections to destroy anyone who opposed him. She'd sworn never to be helpless in the face of such behavior again. Then we make our own proof, she said quietly. Jake looked up at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. What do you mean? You said Fletcher's smart, that he doesn't threaten people directly, but he did threaten us today. Both of us heard it. What if he could be convinced to do it again, in front of witnesses this time? Sarah, that's dangerous. Fletcher's not just some small-town bully. He's got money, connections, and men who'll do anything he tells them. I know. She met his eyes steadily. But I also know something about men like Fletcher. They're arrogant. They believe their own power makes them untouchable, and that arrogance makes them careless. Jake studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her face that hadn't been there before. The frightened woman he'd rescued from the desert was gone, replaced by someone harder, more determined. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah leaned forward, her hands resting on her swollen belly. Fletcher wants our land. He's threatened to spread lies about me to force you to sell. What if we let him think his plan is working? What if we arrange a meeting to discuss terms, but we're not the only ones who show up? You want to set a trap. I want to give him enough rope to hang himself. Sarah's voice was calm, but her eyes blazed with determination. Men like Fletcher always believe they're the smartest person in the room. That's their weakness. Jake was quiet for a long time, considering her words. Finally, he nodded slowly. It might work. Tom Bradley and his wife could be convinced to hide nearby, listen to what Fletcher has to say. If he threatens you again, makes the same accusations. We'd have witnesses, respected members of the community who could testify to what they heard. It's risky, Jake warned. If Fletcher suspects a trap, if his men see the Bradleys, then we'd better be very careful about how we arrange it. Sarah smiled, but there was nothing soft about the expression. Don't worry, Jake, I've dealt with bullies before. As she spoke, the baby gave another strong kick, and Sarah placed her hand over the spot, her expression softening. Besides, I have more than just myself to protect now. Jake watched her, seeing the transformation that had taken place in the past hour. The vulnerable woman who'd fainted in the desert was still there, but underneath was something stronger, a core of steel that all the threats in the world couldn't bend. "All right," he said finally. "We'll try it your way. But Sarah?" "Yes?" "If anything goes wrong, if Fletcher or his men make any move toward you, I want you to run. Get to the Bradleys' place and don't look back." Sarah nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of running if things went bad. She'd run enough in her life, from her stepfather's cruelty, from poverty, from the false promises that had brought her west. This time, she would stand and fight. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Dr. Martin Hawthorne arrived unannounced, his medical bag in hand and concern written across his weathered features. "Thought I'd check on Mrs. Morrison," he announced, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Tom Bradley mentioned you'd married Jake and that your wife was expecting. Figured she could use a proper examination." Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Jake. They'd planned to spend the morning preparing for their confrontation with Fletcher, working out the details of their trap. Instead, she found herself ushered into the bedroom while Dr. Hawthorne conducted a thorough examination. "Everything looks good," he announced afterward, washing his hands in the basin Jake provided. "Baby's positioned well, heartbeat strong. I'd say you've got about 6 weeks left, maybe 8. He dried his hands on a clean towel. "Any problems? Pain, bleeding, unusual swelling?" "No, nothing like that." Sarah smoothed her dress back down, grateful for the doctor's matter-of-fact manner. "I feel fine, mostly, just tired sometimes. That's normal at this stage." Dr. Hawthorne packed his instruments back into his bag. "You're fortunate, Mrs. Morrison. Many women in your condition wouldn't have survived what you went through in the desert." "Dr. Hawthorne," Jake said carefully, "we'd appreciate it if you kept the details of Sarah's condition to yourself. Her due date, I mean." The doctor's bushy eyebrows rose. "Of course. Patient confidentiality is sacred. But may I ask why?" Jake and Sarah had discussed this possibility, that people would start asking questions about when the baby was conceived, whether the timing aligned with their marriage. In a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, such details mattered. "There are people who might use that information to cause trouble," Sarah said simply. "People who would question the legitimacy of our marriage based on timing." Dr. Hawthorne's expression darkened. "Ah, I see. Well, as far as I'm concerned, medical details are nobody's business but the patient's. Anyone asks me, I'll tell them you're a healthy woman expecting her first child, and leave it at that." "Thank you," Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. After the doctor left, Jake and Sarah returned to their planning. They'd decided to send word to Fletcher that Jake was ready to discuss terms, arranging to meet at the old line shack about 2 miles from the ranch house. The location was perfect, isolated enough that Fletcher would feel free to speak openly, but close enough to the Bradley ranch that Tom and his wife could position themselves within earshot. "I still don't like using you as bait," Jake said for the 10th time as they walked the perimeter of the property, checking for signs that Fletcher's men might be watching them. "It's not using me as bait. It's using Fletcher's assumptions against him." Sarah paused to rest against a fence post, one hand pressed to her lower back. "He thinks I'm helpless, that threatening me will force you to cooperate. Let him keep thinking that. And if he tries to carry out those threats, then we'll be ready for him." That evening, Jake rode into town to deliver their message to Fletcher. Sarah spent the time writing letters, one to Dr. Hawthorne, asking him to document the timing of her examination and his medical opinion about her condition, and another to Reverend Williams, requesting a copy of their marriage certificate for their records. Both documents might prove crucial if Fletcher tried to challenge the legitimacy of their marriage or spread rumors about Sarah's past. She sealed the letters carefully and set them aside to be delivered the next day. The baby was unusually active that night, turning and kicking until Sarah finally gave up on sleep and moved to the kitchen to make tea. She was sitting at the table, one hand rubbing circles on her belly, when Jake emerged from his room. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Little one's practicing gymnastics." Sarah smiled ruefully. "I think he knows something's happening tomorrow." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the lamplight. "You don't have to do this, you know. We could pack up tonight, head north to my cousin's place in Montana. Fletcher might follow, but it would give us time to figure out another plan." "Run away, you mean? Start over somewhere else?" Sarah shook her head firmly. "I'm done running, Jake. I ran from my stepfather when he tried to sell me to pay his gambling debts. I ran west on a false promise rather than face the truth about my situation. I'm not running anymore. Even if it means putting yourself and the baby in danger? Especially then." Sarah's voice was steady, sure. "This baby deserves to grow up in a place where bullies don't get their way just because they have money and influence, where good people don't have to choose between their principles and their safety." Jake reached across the table, covering her hand with his. It was the first time he'd touched her voluntarily since their wedding, and the contact sent warmth spreading up her arm. "You're braver than you know," he said quietly. So are you." Sarah turned her hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. "Thank you for standing with me on this. Wouldn't be anywhere else." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked across the table, while the baby settled into stillness inside Sarah's womb. Tomorrow would bring danger, confrontation, and the possibility of violence. But tonight, in the quiet kitchen of their shared home, they were simply two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and decided to fight for the life they'd built together. The line shack sat in a small clearing surrounded by scrub oak and juniper, its weathered walls bearing testament to years of harsh winters and blazing summers. Jake and Sarah arrived an hour before the scheduled meeting, giving them time to position themselves and make final preparations. Tom Bradley and his wife Ruth were already hidden among the rocks about 50 yards away, close enough to hear but far enough to avoid detection. "Remember," Jake said quietly as they waited, "let Fletcher do most of the talking. The more he says, the more likely he is to incriminate himself." Sarah nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. The baby had been still all morning, as if sensing the tension in her body. She pressed one hand to her belly, drawing strength from the life growing inside her. The sound of approaching horses announced Fletcher's arrival. He came with the same two men as before, all three armed and alert. Fletcher dismounted with his usual confidence, straightening his black coat as he approached the shack. Morrison, punctual as always. He tipped his hat to Sarah. "Mrs. Morrison, looking lovely as ever." Jake stepped slightly in front of Sarah, a subtle but clear protective gesture. "You said you had an offer to make." "Indeed I do." Fletcher's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I believe I may have been unnecessarily harsh in my assessment of your wife's situation." "Meaning?" "Meaning that perhaps her past indiscretions needn't become public knowledge. After all, we're all Christian people here. We believe in forgiveness, in second chances." Fletcher's voice dripped false sincerity. "But forgiveness, like everything else in this world, has its price." Sarah felt Jake tense beside her, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of price?" Fletcher turned his full attention to her, his eyes calculating. "Your husband's ranch, of course, plus his cattle and any other assets he might possess. In return, I'll ensure that certain uncomfortable questions about your past never reach the territorial marshal's ears." "What questions?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. "Oh, you know. Questions about the mail-order bride arrangement that brought you here. Questions about whether you might have been running from something back east. Questions about the true nature of your relationship with your husband, and whether your marriage is quite as legitimate as it appears." Fletcher took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried clearly to where the Bradleys were hidden. "See, I've done some investigating, Mrs. Morrison. And what I've discovered is quite fascinating. The William MacBride who supposedly summoned you to Colorado, he never existed, which means you came here under false pretenses, possibly as part of some larger deception." "That's not true," Sarah said, but Fletcher waved away her protest. "The truth is what I say it is, my dear. I have connections throughout the territory. One word from me, and you'll find yourself facing charges of fraud, conspiracy, possibly even bigamy if we discover you were already married back east." Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Sarah caught his wrist, stopping him. This was exactly what they needed. Fletcher making specific threats, laying out his blackmail scheme in detail. "And if we refuse?" she asked. Fletcher's mask of false courtesy slipped, revealing the cold predator underneath. "Then I'm afraid you'll find life in this territory very difficult indeed. Decent people don't associate with women of questionable virtue. Shopkeepers stop extending credit. Neighbors stop lending helping hands. And pregnant women in your condition, well, they need all the help they can get, don't they?" The threat was clear and unmistakable. Fletcher was essentially promising to destroy Sarah's reputation and isolate her from any community support, leaving her vulnerable and dependent just when she needed protection most. "You son of a bitch," Jake snarled, his hand closing on his gun butt. Now," Fletcher said, his two companions shifting alertly behind him. "Let's keep this civilized. I'm offering you a generous deal, Morrison. Your ranch is worth maybe $3,000. I'm prepared to pay $5,000, plus safe passage for you and your wife to California or wherever else you might want to start fresh. And if we don't take your generous offer?" Fletcher's smile returned, sharp as a blade. "Then Mrs. Morrison's troubles become everyone's troubles. Amazing how quickly a community can turn against someone when doubts are raised about their character, especially someone carrying a bastard child." The insult hit like a physical blow, and Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. She was stronger than that now, but crack enough to let the fury through. "My child is not a bastard," she said quietly, her voice carrying a deadly calm that made Fletcher's eyes narrow. "That remains to be seen, doesn't it? After all, who's to say when the child was conceived? Who's to say your marriage is anything more than a convenient lie?" Fletcher had just made his fatal mistake. In his arrogance, he'd not only threatened Sarah and her unborn child, but had questioned the legitimacy of her marriage in front of witnesses. In territorial law, such accusations constituted slander and harassment, punishable by both civil and criminal penalties. "I think we've heard enough," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Fletcher frowned, confused by her sudden change in tone. "Heard enough of what?" "Enough to hang you in court." Sarah smiled, and there was nothing gentle about the expression. "Tom, Ruth, I think you can come out now." The Bradleys emerged from their hiding place, Tom carrying a rifle and Ruth clutching a notebook where she'd been frantically writing down everything Fletcher had said. Fletcher's face went white, then red with rage. "You clever little bitch! You set me up!" "No," Sarah said calmly. "You set yourself up. We just gave you the rope." Fletcher's hand moved toward his gun, but Jake was faster, his Colt clearing leather with practiced ease. "I wouldn't," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." Tom Bradley had his rifle trained on Fletcher's two companions, while Ruth continued scribbling in her notebook, documenting every word for the territorial authorities. Fletcher's face twisted with fury, but he was smart enough to recognize a losing situation. This isn't over, Morrison. You think you've won, but I have resources you can't imagine. Connections that reach all the way to Denver. Maybe, Jake conceded, but you've just confessed to blackmail, extortion, and slander in front of 3 witnesses. Ruth Bradley is the daughter of a territorial judge, and her word carries weight in any court in Colorado. Fletcher's eyes flicked to Ruth, and some of the color drained from his face. The Bradleys were old frontier family, respected throughout the territory. Ruth's testimony would be devastating in any legal proceeding. "You're making a mistake," Fletcher said, but the bluster was gone from his voice. "All of you, I was offering you a way out, a chance to avoid bloodshed. Now," he shrugged, trying to regain his composure, "now things will have to be settled the hard way." "Are you threatening us again?" Sarah asked sweetly. "Because Mrs. Bradley is still taking notes." Fletcher's jaw worked silently for a moment before he turned and stalked back to his horse. "This conversation never happened," he said as he mounted. "Anyone claims otherwise, it's their word against mine and my men's." 3-3, Tom Bradley observed mildly. "Except we've got it all written down. And unlike your men, we don't have criminal records." Fletcher's companions exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was clear they hadn't signed up for a fight against respectable citizens with no criminal history to hide behind. "Let's go," Fletcher snarled, spurring his horse toward the trees. "We're done here." As the 3 men disappeared into the timber, Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. The confrontation was over, and they'd gotten everything they needed to protect themselves legally. "That was well done," Ruth Bradley said, closing her notebook with satisfaction. "I got every word. That man just confessed to enough crimes to put him away for years. Assuming we can get a fair hearing," Tom added grimly. Fletcher wasn't lying about having connections. Money talks loud in territorial politics. "Then we'll make sure the right people hear this evidence," Jake said. "Dr. Hawthorne knows judges in Denver. So does Reverend Williams. Between them and Mrs. Bradley's father, we should be able to find someone Fletcher can't buy or intimidate." Sarah nodded, but she was only half listening to the conversation. Something was wrong. A cramping sensation in her lower back that had started during the confrontation and was getting worse. She pressed one hand to her belly, feeling the baby moving restlessly inside her. "Sarah?" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You all right?" "I think," Sarah began, then gasped as a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. "Oh, God." The world tilted sideways, and she felt Jake's strong arms catch her as her knees buckled. The stress of the confrontation, combined with the physical strain of her pregnancy, had finally taken its toll. "Ruth!" Tom Bradley called. "We need to get her to the doctor." "No time," Ruth said, kneeling beside Sarah with the calm competence of a woman who'd delivered babies on the frontier before. "This baby's coming now." Jake's face went white. "It's too early. She's got 6 weeks left." "Tell that to the baby," Ruth said grimly. "Tom, ride to town and fetch Dr. Hawthorne. Jake, we need to get Sarah somewhere more comfortable than the ground." Sarah tried to speak, to tell them she was fine, that this was just false labor brought on by stress. But another contraction seized her, stronger than the first, and she bit back a cry of pain. The baby was coming, ready or not. As Jake lifted her carefully in his arms, Sarah caught sight of Fletcher's horse disappearing into the distance. Even through her pain, she felt a grim satisfaction. Whatever happened now, they'd won this battle. Fletcher's threats had no power over them anymore. But the war for their future was just beginning, and it would be fought in a courtroom rather than a clearing, if she and the baby survived the next few hours. The line shack had been built for shelter, not comfort, but Ruth Bradley transformed it into a makeshift birthing room with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Jake paced outside like a caged wolf while Tom rode hard for town to fetch Dr. Hawthorne. Inside the shack, Sarah fought through contractions that came faster and stronger with each passing hour. "Too early?" she gasped between pains. "It's too early." "Sometimes babies have their own schedule," Ruth said calmly, wiping Sarah's face with a damp cloth. "Stress can bring on labor, and you've had more than your share lately." Sarah gripped Ruth's hand as another contraction seized her. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Waves of agony that started in her back and spread through her entire body. But underneath the pain was something else. Fear. Not for herself, but for the tiny life struggling to enter the world too soon. "Is the baby going to be all right?" she asked when the contraction passed. "Babies born at 7 months have a fighting chance," Ruth said honestly, "especially if they're good-sized. Your little one's been active, which is a good sign." Outside, Sarah could hear Jake's boots wearing a path in the dirt. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him she was all right, but another contraction stole her breath away. Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. The sun was setting by the time Dr. Hawthorne arrived, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with concern. "How far apart are the contractions?" he asked Ruth as he scrubbed his hands in a basin of hot water Tom had prepared. "Every 2 minutes. She's been pushing for the last hour." Dr. Hawthorne examined Sarah quickly, his touch gentle but thorough. "The baby's in a good position," he announced. "Small, but that might actually help with the delivery." "Is everything... will the baby be?" Sarah couldn't finish the question. "We'll know soon enough," the doctor said kindly. "Right now, I need you to focus on bringing this little one into the world safely." The final stage of labor was a battle between Sarah's determination and her body's exhaustion. She'd been in labor for nearly 12 hours, and her strength was fading fast. But every time she felt like giving up, she thought about Jake waiting outside, about the life they were trying to build together, about the future this baby represented. "I can see the head," Dr. Hawthorne announced. "One more push, Sarah. Give me everything you've got." Sarah bore down with the last of her strength, and suddenly the pressure was gone. The world filled with the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. "A girl," Dr. Hawthorne said, his voice filled with wonder. "A beautiful little girl." Sarah collapsed back against the makeshift pillows, tears streaming down her face as the doctor cleaned and examined her daughter. The baby's cry was weak but persistent, the sound of a fighter determined to survive. "She's small," Dr. Hawthorne said as he wrapped the infant in a clean blanket. "Maybe 4 pounds, but her lungs are working and her color's good. She's got a real chance." He placed the baby in Sarah's arms, and she stared down at the tiny face in amazement. Her daughter was perfect, miniature but complete, with dark hair like her own and serious gray eyes that reminded her of Jake. "Can I?" Jake's voice came from the doorway, rough with emotion. "Come in," Sarah said softly. "Come meet your daughter." Jake approached slowly, as if afraid he might break something precious. When he saw the baby, his entire face transformed. The careful mask he wore dissolved, replaced by pure wonder. "She's so small," he whispered. "But strong," Sarah said, adjusting the blanket so he could see the baby's face better. "She's a fighter, like her father." Jake reached out tentatively, letting the baby's tiny fist close around his calloused finger. The gesture was so tender, so protective, that Sarah felt her heart crack open with love for this man who'd given her and her child safety when they had nothing. "What will you name her?" Ruth asked, cleaning up the remnants of the birth with quiet efficiency. Sarah looked at Jake, seeing the love and acceptance in his eyes. This man had married her to give her child legitimacy, had fought for them both when Fletcher threatened their future. There was only one name that felt right. "Elizabeth," she said softly. "Elizabeth Morrison." Jake's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "After my wife?" "After the woman who would have loved this little girl if she'd lived to meet her." Sarah reached out to touch Jake's face. "And after the man who's shown us both what it means to have a family." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song to the moon. But inside the little shack, 3 people who'd found each other in the wilderness held a tiny miracle and planned for a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of their expanded cabin, watching Jake teach 9-month-old Elizabeth to clap her hands. The baby gurgled with delight at the game, her chubby fingers coming together in an approximation of applause that made Jake's face light up with pride. Elizabeth had thrived despite her early arrival, growing into a healthy, happy child who ruled the Morrison household with her infectious smile and iron will. "She's got you wrapped around her little finger," Sarah teased, setting a plate of fresh biscuits on the table. "Can't help it," Jake admitted, lifting Elizabeth to sit on his knee. "She's got her mother's stubborn streak and her father's charm." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Her father's charm?" "Well, somebody had to provide the charm in this family." The easy banter between them was a far cry from the careful politeness of their early marriage. Somewhere in the months following Elizabeth's birth, the barriers between them had crumbled. What had started as a marriage of convenience had become something deeper, richer, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and genuine affection. The legal battle with Fletcher had been resolved in their favor, thanks to Ruth Bradley's detailed notes and the testimony of Dr. Hawthorne and Reverend Williams. Fletcher had been charged with extortion, blackmail, and harassment, resulting in substantial fines and a court order prohibiting him from contacting the Morrisons or their neighbors. His political connections hadn't been enough to save him from the weight of evidence against him. More importantly, the railroad had arrived on schedule, bringing prosperity to the entire valley. The depot had been built on Morrison land, just as Fletcher had predicted, providing Jake and Sarah with enough money to expand their ranch and secure their family's future. "Letter came today," Jake said, reaching into his vest pocket. "From your friend in Boston." Sarah's hands stilled on the biscuit dough. She'd written to her former schoolmistress 6 months ago, finally ready to share the truth about her new life. The response had taken longer than expected. "What does Miss Hartwell say?" Jake handed her the letter, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah had shared most of her past with him by now, but there were still parts of her life in Boston that remained private territory. Sarah read quickly, her face brightening with each paragraph. "She's coming for a visit. She wants to meet Elizabeth and see what I've made of myself out here in the savage wilderness." Sarah laughed. "I'm afraid Miss Hartwell has some rather dramatic ideas about life in the territories." "Will you be glad to see her?" Sarah considered the question seriously. A year ago, the prospect of facing someone from her past life would have terrified her. Now, she felt only excitement at the thought of showing Miss Hartwell the life she'd built. "Yes," she said simply. "I think I will." That evening, after Elizabeth had been fed and put to bed in the nursery Jake had built adjoining their bedroom, Sarah and Jake sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean. Taking on someone else's problems." Jake was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, certain. "I regret a lot of things in my life. I regret not being here when Elizabeth and Mary were killed. I regret the years I spent angry at the world, pushing away anyone who tried to help. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. But marrying you? Becoming Elizabeth's father? Those are the best decisions I've ever made. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, even though it wasn't what either of us planned. Especially because it wasn't what we planned. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as disasters. As if summoned by their conversation, Elizabeth's cry drifted from the nursery. Not distressed, just making her presence known. Sarah started to rise, but Jake caught her hand. "I'll get her," he said. "You've been on your feet all day." Sarah watched him disappear into the cabin, listening to his low voice as he comforted their daughter. Their daughter, not just hers anymore, but theirs in every way that mattered. Jake had legally adopted Elizabeth after their marriage became real, giving her his name and his protection for life. When he returned with the baby, Elizabeth was wide awake and alert, her gray eyes, so like Jake's, taking in the world around her with curious intelligence. She wanted to see the sunset, Jake explained, settling back into his chair with Elizabeth cradled against his chest. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Elizabeth dozed fitfully, waking occasionally to grab at Jake's shirt or make soft baby sounds that required no response beyond gentle attention. "Jake," Sarah said softly, "thank you. For everything. For saving my life. For giving Elizabeth a father. For showing me what home really means." He reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand in his free one. "Thank you for bringing love back into this house. For giving me a reason to believe in the future again." As the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across their land, Sarah Morrison felt a deep contentment settle into her bones. The journey that had brought her here, the lies, the betrayal, the desperate flight into the wilderness, had nearly destroyed her. But from that destruction had come something precious. A family, a home, and a love that had grown from the hardest soil into something beautiful and lasting. The baby stirred in Jake's arms, and he began to hum softly, a lullaby Sarah recognized as one his own mother had sung to him. Elizabeth's eyes drifted closed, her tiny fist curled around her father's finger, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the best love stories weren't the ones that began with passion and romance. Sometimes they were the ones that began with two broken people deciding to trust each other enough to build something new from the pieces of their shattered lives. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those stories had the most beautiful endings of all. Thank you so much for joining me on Sarah and Jake's incredible journey of love, resilience, and second chances in the wild frontier. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe for more captivating tales from the American West, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next adventure together, may you always find courage in difficult times and love in unexpected places.